As I record this, we are heading further into winter in Shetland, which means that for many people around the islands, they are getting deeper and deeper into their preparations for Up Helly Aa. This series of fire festivals has evolved over the years into a celebration of our Viking heritage and culture here in the islands, and you can learn more about it in the video linked down in the description below. With that in mind, I thought this would be the ideal time to share a Viking story from Unst with you. I originally posted this one on Patreon for our supporters over there. For those who maybe don't know, Patreon is a platform where I can share extra content such as this with you, but also give it extra context and additional information to subscribers for a monthly fee. If you'd like more information about what Patreon is, I have another video linked again down in the description below. In the meantime, get yourself comfortable, settle in for the story, the classic tale of Goturm the Dane. Today for this first episode, I'm going to tell you, or I suppose probably more accurately, read you the story of Goturm the Dane, which is a Viking story from Unst, our northmost island. Once we've gone through the story, we'll then take a look at some of the locations and set the story into context on the ground, and give some sort of wider context to the characters involved as well. And then to finish up with, we'll look at how the story has sort of provided inspiration for people in modern times as well, with a few examples to kind of illustrate that this story has continued to be relevant to people in Shetland right up to the modern day. So here we go. I'm going to read the story as it's written in A.T. Clunas's Told Round the Peat Fire. It's kind of the definitive version of the story, and it's from one of the original collections of Shetland folktales. These ones are primarily from Unst. I apologise if you hear pages turning and things like that. I can't really help it when I'm working with an old book. But yeah, the story is titled Goturm's Hole in the book here. But yeah, it's the story of Goturm the Dane, as I like to call it. So I'll have a swig of tea and then we'll get underway. Okay, Chapter 1. If you're ever sufficiently fortunate, or unfortunate if you're a poor sailor, to coast along the towering cliffs that forever and forever beat back the surge of the Atlantic from the northwest corner of Unst, most northerly of the Shetland Isles, you may be all agog as you pass Tonga's grim precipice to catch a glimpse of the lighthouse on Muckleflugga, the ultimate rocks of the British Isles. Of course, if the north tide from Bloomalsund happens to be running in the teeth of a strong north wind, you may be in a condition where you couldn't care less, but if you can, spare a glance landward to the curving rampart of cliffs. At its innermost part, some 200 feet above the sea, and more than halfway up, you may see a little recess, black in contrast with the surrounding rock. It is still marked on the Ordnance Survey map of Scotland, 1 inch to the mile, as Goturm's Hole. And thereby hangs a tale on the fringe of history's mantle, a tale unusual enough to have survived 1,000 years, with a heroine who stands forth clearly at the head of a long line of self-willed, clear-minded, toiling women, who throughout the many generations have made life endurable for themselves and others, in a clime which ever demands the utmost effort. Torbjorn Hrolaugsson, or Treefoot behind his back, dwelt in Burrowfirth, and on this bright April morning, a somewhat soured and discontented man was he, as he reflected that time had been when he was a fairly wealthy Viking in the Son district of Vestland, over the sea in Norway. These had been happy days, with leisurely cruises in the warmer seas along the coasts far to the south, where the rich but unwarlike Frisian traders, in their deep-bellied lumbering trading ships, came adventuring north towards the Baltic, or even an occasional quick raid nearer home along Hogland, Namdal and more. But Harald Halfdanson, curse him, and may Hela's coldest corner be his, had put an end to all that. Little by little, first in the north, then in the west and the south, he had made himself all-powerful in Norway, and in the end, Torbjorn had been on the losing side at Hafrsfjord. To men like himself it had meant the end of all things, and with many others of the Son folk he had made his way overseas and had settled in Shetland. Here at any rate he was free, and his little domain of Burrowfirth, hilly and barren though most of it was, included some good land, quite good arable, as well as pasture land which the Picts had held and improved for many generations. He had taken, of course, as much as he required for himself and the 36 stout fellows who, with their families and as much of their possessions as could be carried, had accompanied him from Norway. The settlement had proved easy of accomplishment. Though there had been a little resistance, it was stamped out in no long time. The pathetic ruins of the broch where the natives had put up their last fight faced his modest hall on Stackhool. There were great gaps in its round wall, for the stone had been found very useful for building purposes. The surviving Picts had been enthralled, and now toiled, more or less willingly, for their masters. And he, Torbjorn, was their master, in spite of the respect and the quiet deference they paid to old Cool, their priestman. Strange fellow, Cool. Living in his little beehive cell and worshipping with singing and long prayers and fasting his queer, feeble god, who very apparently was not a fighter like Thor, nor a ruler like Odin, but believed in loving his enemies, and had even once been put to a horrible death without a struggle. Well, well, let his enemies and all weaklings believe in such a god by all means. They would be all the more easily overcome. For himself, Valhalla in the end was good enough. He knew some fine, stout fellows already there. Plenty of fighting, plenty of food and drink, and when the far distant morning of Ragnarok at last arrived, a really grand fighting finish by the side of Thor and all good fighting men. Would he be, however, among the fighting men? Would a man maimed on earth have all his limbs whole in Valhalla? One could not quite be sure. Odin himself had lost one of his eyes, and remained one-eyed even in Valhalla. He glanced wryly at his own crippled form. His wrists and arms were substantial and strong, but his left leg was of wood. His right was not as it should be, twisted a bit, and painful at times. But for Cool, he would have lost that too, crushed as he had been between ship and rocks when the first landing was hurriedly made in heavy seas in face of irritating opposition from the Picts with their slings, arrows, and throwing spears. Queer fellow, Cool. Lucky for him that his men had learned from their captives that their priestman was skilled in healing. Lucky for himself, too. It had been touch and go for his life for a time, but Cool had pulled him through. Though one leg was gone forever, nobody could help that, and the priestman had been rewarded. He was allowed to live in comparative freedom. But he had to be warned not to interfere or to presume. His task was to heal men's bodies hurt in battle, to cure them of sickness, and to do him justice he did his work well. As for talking, let him talk, to the thralls. Real men, Son Vikings who had fought and continued to fight against Harold, that self-styled king, curse him, disregarded him. From the wooded bench facing northward beside the great door, as he looked out on the long firth ruffled with the fresh north wind, the waves danced, and flashing here in the sunshine, and there a sudden black from the shadows of obscuring cloud. He suddenly cried out, "Auslag! Auslag!" And his daughter, mistress of the house since her mother died 10 years ago, appeared almost on the instant. Tall, blue-eyed, fair-haired, bright of complexion, and with rather high, prominent cheekbones, square-shouldered and deep-bosomed, in the bloom of age, she was worth looking at, but Torbjorn at that moment had no eyes for her. Pointing with the stout staff that ever accompanied him, he said, "Isn't that the sea snake at the far side of Lyrestack? See, coming round the point." She looked, and keen-eyed though she was, for a little she hesitated. If it was the sea snake, then something had happened. Anlaf, her brother, with the best of the able-bodied men, had gone a week ago on a raid to Norway, and should now be returning. But this did not look like a triumphant return, with the sail set, streamers flying, and oars dipping and flashing in perfect time. The vessel was now passing the stack, crawling slowly and unevenly, like a maimed seabird past the high cliffs of flanking Saxiford. "Yes, it's the sea snake. I'll run down and find out what..." And without waiting for the remonstrance she knew was coming, she hurried away. Torbjorn sat anxious and angry, anxious for his son, angry at his daughter's behaviour. No woman had any right to accompany men to the beach on their departure, or greet them at the beach on their return. The proper place for goodbye and welcome was in the home. Before Auslag reached the shore, she was joined by many a hurrying boy and thrall, while from the little steadings on either side of the Voe the anxious eyes of women continued to gaze. Slowly, and without a hail or cheer, the little longship approached the roughly built jetty at the rocky west end of the beautiful stretch of sands that bounded the south end of the firth. To the man waiting on the bench by Stackel's door, it seemed a long time before Auslag returned. He scarcely recognised until they stood before him the two men who accompanied her up the brae. One was Einar, Anlaf's bosom friend, strongest warrior and best runner in the island. He had come limping with his head bandaged. Only later did Torbjorn learn that his right ear had been shorn away. And Ivar, the acknowledged best of a great race of seamen, a man in whose hands every boat, provided it could float, became a living, joyful thing. Ivar stood, his right arm supported in a blood-stained sling. They had sailed away with Anlaf, and now stood with drooping heads before Torbjorn. "Where is Anlaf?" They raised their head, looked fixedly at him for a time, their gaze firmly holding his. "In Valhalla," said Einar at last. Torbjorn, his hands clenching their grip on each other, leaned forward. "He died well? Need you ask?" Ivar stepped forward, and with his left hand laid at Torbjorn's feet a naked sword, flashing here and dulled there with rusty stains. "Anlaf's sword. My sword," muttered Torbjorn as he gazed upon it. "Yes," said Einar, and the pain of his wounded head made him appear to grin as he clenched his teeth. "It was sent to you by his slayer, with his compliments on a brave son." "Auslag, bring them something to drink." The men drank in silence, and bowed slightly to Auslag in thanks. "Now," said Torbjorn, "tell your tale, and briefly." "An ill tale is soon told," replied Ivar quietly, raising his hand for a moment to his head. "We reached the coast of Norway far to the south. While we were debating whether to land at once or sail north and enter a fjord by night, a ship came up from the southern, heavy laden and slow. We attacked, met with far stronger resistance than we had expected, and in the fight had 3 men killed and 5 badly hurt. It was past noon before we took the ship, and the best of its cargo was stowed aboard until the Snake was so deep in the water that Anlaf would allow no more. Darkness had fallen before we turned our prow westward, leaving to the Frisian merchants who survived their ship much lighter than before, but their throats still safe. Yesterday we had fine sailing wind, and had sped so well that towards evening we judged we might reach Burrowford by midnight. All the voyage we had not seen a sail but that of the ship we took, but now, out of the evening haze to the south, there came into view on the backboard of a large ship of war. As she neared, she showed a great yellow sail on which writhed emblazoned a huge red serpent. She overhauled us fast, dropped down her sail, 30 pairs of oars flashed out, and with but 18 men at our oars we had no hope of escape. With a great yell they drove alongside, and 2 huge warriors leapt aboard where Anlaf stood. The first stumbled, and Anlaf's sword was through him and out again before the body touched the deck, but the other would have cut him down had not Ivar intervened and got what you see. Before he could raise his axe again, Anlaf's sword was through his throat. The men at the oars were overwhelmed by a great rush from the waist of the enemy ship. We did what we could, but the fight did not endure long. Soon we were all down or disarmed but Anlaf, and 3 men now lay dead before him. Then a squat, heavy-shouldered man in a fine cloak and golden helmet, the man who seemed their leader, and had taken no part in the fighting, shouted, "Leave him to me," and bounded on the deck. Short time they fought, and Anlaf fell. They despoiled and threw the dead overboard, the sea-wolves, their own as well as ours, and they took everything from us they wanted, all that we had taken from the Frisian, and even some of our weapons. Their dark leader seemed to be everywhere and to attend to everything. He smiled and talked to us, and by his tongue he was a Dane. He asked whether any of us cared to join forces with him, and said that we could make our fortunes. We all refused, of course. He asked the name of our leader, and said that he was a good lad and would have been a comrade worth his salt. He left us sufficient food and water for our needs, and even wished us a safe voyage home. Before he left our ship with his wolves, he turned to Ivar and handed Anlaf's sword to him. "Give Anlaf's sword to Anlaf's father, with Goturm's greeting." The ships parted, and we left them stowing away their plunder in the gathering darkness. And so, only here, by a slight break in his voice, did Einar show any emotion as he looked on the old man sitting on the bench. "And so we came home, as you see. Of the 30 men who sailed with Anlaf, 18 are now with them in Valhalla, and of the others, 2 at least soon will be. He said no more, but glanced at Ivar, who gave a short nod of assent. Aslaug had quietly moved round behind Torbjorn's bench. Now her eyes dropped from Einar's face to her father's head. He too had listened with look intent, but now his eyes rested upon the sword which lay at his feet, the long, beautifully fashioned hilt affording grip for both hands, the handguard with its design of intertwining bronze snakes, the blade with its significant stains. The blood of his only son was at this moment probably still on Goturm's blade, and Anlaf was now floating somewhere, a dead thing, the prey of fishes and seabirds. He came to himself abruptly. "You must enter the house and rest a little. Aslaug, send to Kull and have him attend the wounded, taking everyone and everything he needs. But first bid him come here to attend to these 2. And Einar at any rate needed attention, for his face was chalky white, and he swayed where he stood. Torbjorn rose to his feet as Aslaug replied. Kull was at the beach even before the Snake reached the jetty. You know his way. He went on board with 2 or 3 others and immediately began attending to those who needed him most. He's doing all he can. For Audi and Hakon, said Ivar, he can do little. They have fought their last fight. He was a man of few words, and you would not have guessed that Hakon was his brother for whom he would have died. But here comes the man himself. A little bent, bald-headed man, clad in a rough grey woolen mantle, girdled at the waist with a strong cord from which dangled a small crucifix fashioned of bog oak, came up to them. He bowed to Torbjorn, slightly motioned with his hand, and said, "The peace of God be with you." Torbjorn suddenly seemed to be aware of him. He raised his head and frowned. "How did you find them, Kull?" "Many are sore hurt, 2 very badly, but I have done what I could. The rest is in God's hands, and He can do all things." Turning to Ivar and Einar, he sighed. "Here are others who must be attended to." He approached Einar and, speaking in a low voice, indicated that he should enter the house. Torbjorn stooped and raised the sword in his right hand, aiding himself with his staff, and with Aslaug behind his right shoulder, led the way. Kull made Einar and Ivar seat themselves and began to busy himself about them, but Torbjorn's mind, numbed as it had been with the terrible tidings, had stirred his movement. Kull's words had enraged him beyond control. He burst forth in a shout. "Kull, look here! What do you see here?" He drew all eyes as he dashed the sword to the stone-paved floor where it clattered and rang. He pointed to it. "There lies Anlaf's sword, and Anlaf is dead. He who was laughing and singing here a week ago. And your God can do all things, can he? Let him bring back all those that are gone. Let him bring back my son. Nay, let him even put his slayer in my power for an hour. No, that would be too short a time. For a day, and then I'll become a White Christ man and all my men afterwards." Kull raised his hand in warning. "Anger not God, Torbjorn. His ways are not as ours." Before Torbjorn could retort, there came a cringing into the hall, a little dark man with shaggy hair and unkempt beard. His quick eyes darted round. Barefooted, he shuffled to Kull's side, and with his head thrust forward, he looked at Aslaug as though for permission to speak. "What is it, Glam? What do you hear?" "Master," he said eagerly, addressing Torbjorn but not daring to look directly at him. "Master, great ship go down. Many men die." "Quiet, Glam," said Aslaug. "The sea snake has not sunk, but is at the beach. Why have you left your sheep at Tonga? The summer sheep pasture was there." A fringe of beautiful green along the top of the sheer precipices running all the way to Hermaness. But the Pictish thrall wriggled his shoulders as he shrank from the reproof. No, not sea snake. Great strange ship. Before sun came I was at cliff top, but could no see far. Thick mist, so thick no could see down to water. Suddenly great crash, and men shouting. Then mist clear, woof, and great ship, sail, flap, sticking on sunken rock near point. Big waves turn her round the rock, but she still sticks, falling over slow. When sudden over she go, and down. 2-3 men swim, sometime here, there, dots just like seal heads in sea, go down. Einar had sat quietly submitting to the care of Kull, who with linen and a basin of water wordlessly brought by a maid on Aslaug's direction, was tending a ghastly wound on the side of his head. Now, even in the process of being bandaged, he half rose from his seat. "Glam, did you see her sail clearly?" "Yes, Great yellow sail go flap flap, and red snake wriggle like mad until water drown him. Goturn's ship! Shouted Einar and Ivar together. The silence that ensued was broken by Torbjorn. And they all went down. A pity. A pity. Yes, no, said Glam, venturing for an instant to glance at his master. They go down, down, and now only one left. He swim, and rest, and swim, and reach cliff. No can grip, and turn, and swim along and grip, drop off in sea again like mouse in bucket, then try again, and now get good hold, drag him up, and begin to climb. No one, interjected Ivar, has ever climbed the cliffs at Tonga. As one of the best cragsmen he spoke from experience. Einar agreed. No man ever did or ever will. But he climb, interposed Glam excitedly, his dark eyes flashing. Up and up he go, sometime almost slip, sometime stop long time. Once come down a little, try this side, that side, then up, up. Birds scream about him, flap wings, all beside him, he no heed. He climb 100, 200, maybe more. Now he stop in a little hole in cliff. No can do no more. Cliff too steep. No go down, no go up any more. Did you see him clearly? What was he like? Asked Einar, who felt he already knew. He no big fair like you. He no so big, dark like me, big head, great strong shoulders, big arms, bright ring on left arm, sunshine flash on it. Einar now rose to his feet and motioned Cool away. This man is Goturm, he almost shouted. He had a ring of gold on his left wrist. I saw it when with both his hands he held out Anlaf's sword to Ivar. Cool's god has given him to you. Yes, said Ivar in a voice of awe. It must be the man himself. Cool's hands twitched nervously. He grasped the little crucifix at his side and held it before him in both his hands. Torbjorn stood silent for quite a time. Then, as one who had reached a decision, he issued his commands. If Cool's god has given him to me, I must keep my vow. For the present, and firstly, let the crew of the Sea Snake go, or be carried to their homes and rest tonight. Tell Rowdy Askelson to take the young lads and go with Glam to Tonga. Let him shout to the sea wolf and ask his name. It may be he will reply. Then, if Rowdy is certain that the cliff cannot be scaled from the place in which the man lurks, let him go to Petister, gather all the thralls and proceed south as far as Lundawick to salvage anything that has come ashore. Auslag, go with the lads and bring me word in haste if it is he. Then if you choose, you shall help me carve the blood eagle on your brother's slayer. Now go all of you and leave me. Without a word more they left him, and he bent his gaze upon the sword. After a time he raised his eyes to find Cool, who alone had remained standing by the door, looking sadly and intently at him. Angered at the steady look, he shouted, Away, man, there should be ample work for you this day, and if you find nought else to do, make ready the robes and chrism bands. When we have settled the reckoning with Goturm, I shall keep my word, and we shall become your god's men. Man, man, said Cool, and he raised his hand as though warding off a blow. Would you come with bloody hands to him who said, Love your enemies? A bargain is a bargain, and my word is given. But as to loving my enemies, that makes no sense at all. If I must listen to such talk, it shall be later. Away! Cool took his departure, and almost unaware turned southward, until he reached the mill not far from the end of Loch of Cliff's dark waters. Turning now westward, up a narrow valley which slowly climbed between bare enclosing moor-clad shoulders of hilly slope, he ascended with eyes downcast and troubled mind, following the mill burn whose source was at no great distance from the headland of Tonga itself. His heart ached with pity for all the sorrow that had befallen, for all the suffering he had seen that day, and God seemed to have receded to a remote distance. Slowly did he go, that just before he reached the top of the valley, Auslag, returning from the cliff, met him face to face on the footpath beside the stream. It would not have been wonderful if he had failed to recognise her. Gone were the jaunty carriage and air with which she was wont to make light of long distances and arduous work with sheep and cattle and hay. Her face spoke only of utter grief and misery. Is it he? Yes, the girl replied. By going round a little way where the cliff top turns, we can see the cave in which he sits. On the boy's shouting, he came and sat with his legs dangling over a sheer space. Rowdy cried out and asked him his name, and he replied, Goturm am I, Goturm the Dane. Some boy threw a stone at him, and he moved quickly back out of sight. Rowdy and all the others say the cliff cannot be climbed. So there he will sit until your father drags him out and slays him horribly. He slew Anlaf. And it gives you pleasure to think of this man being slain in return for your brother's death? It does not. It cannot bring him back, or any of those who have gone. But I must bring the news to my father. Cool turned back with her. He felt as helpless as if he were on a boat lost in the mist, and they walked on in silence, which was broken only by the murmur of the burn, and now and then the cry of a gull or the croak of a skua. Presently a bare point of rocky outcrop, crowned with a tuft of grass, thrust out into the line of the stream, and here the water gurgled over rocks that barred its course. Auslug stopped, and tears filled her eyes. "Oh, why did your gods or mine ever make men?" The words came with a rush. "See that tuft of grass? There, when we were children, Anlaf and I found a lark's nest with the young ones, and we loved them, and were careful not to go too near or touch them. Even the birds know us to be hateful, deadly things. And we were happy. Why do we have to grow up? Anlaf, who loved the little birds and seldom spoke an angry word to anyone, and never one to me. Anlaf grows up and kills men who were once little boys, and it may be lovebirds too. And Anlaf is killed by Goturm, and Goturm sits waiting to be carved to death by Torbjorn and Einar. And tonight in Burrafurt, women sit lonely, women whose sons and husbands and lovers will come back no more. And somewhere else are the womenfolk of those who died in Goturm's ship, not knowing yet their loss. If the gods had to create man, why, oh why, did they make women, to toil, to grieve, weakly to try to quell the savage angers of men, to submit to men as slaves or as passing playthings, to bear children in pain and to rear them in sorrow, knowing that the little things that suck their breasts will some day mangle their fellow men and be mangled by them? Man surely was made by Loki the Wicked One in one of his most evil moods. And yet, said Cool gently, there was one man far mightier than any man who ever lived, stronger if he wished than even your god Thor, wiser than your Odin. He could have overthrown whole armies with his own hand, and yet he said, love your enemies, and allowed himself to suffer a cruel death because he loved men. Surely he thought there was some good in men to love them so. He was a brave man truly if he did as you say, but he died to no purpose. No, he tried to show man by his own example that love is greater than hatred, forgiveness than revenge, and he still lives to help those who try to follow his teaching. I don't understand. How can he live if he died? Someday, maybe you will tell me more. Now I must hurry to my father. She quickened her pace impatiently and hurried away. Cool did not attempt to keep pace with her, and was soon left behind. Chapter 2. Few except the exhausted survivors of the sea snakes slept soundly that night. It was late when Rowdy and the boys returned to Burrafurt. They had found considerable spoil from the wrecked ship, bales of cloth, casks of wine, some oars and several spars. They had high hopes that tomorrow's tides would increase their finding, and they were eager to be off again with the early dawn to Woodwick, and to the coast to the south. For the time being, they had been almost forgetful of their dead fathers, or brothers, or kinsfolk, and it was only when they reached their silent homes that full realization came to them. Not so the womenfolk, who had only their thoughts, or wounded men for company. Torbjorn got little sleep. From a struggling but not unprosperous community, his following had now been reduced to a mere handful of partly disabled men. No longer would it be possible to carry out the annual spring raid on Norway, or elsewhere, on even the smallest scale. Years must elapse before such a thing could again be possible, and in any case, Anlaf was dead. Toil and meagre return for it was all that remained to the dreary end of a cripple's life. No, not quite. He must settle accounts with the pirate first. All manner of dreadful thoughts possessed him of fiendish things to be done to the slayer of his son. Boiling, burning, maiming, and the blood eagle at the last. His enemy was in his power, like a fish in a net. Let him remain in his hole for a time, but not too long though, lest he should escape by death. When Goturm was dead, he would become Cool's god's man. A promise was a promise, and it didn't matter anyway. Nothing mattered. Anlaf was dead, his only son. Yes, but he had his slayer. So round and round went the millstone of his thoughts. Auslag in her bed tossed wearily. She was tired, but sleep did not come. Anlaf's fair hair now washed to and fro in the sea, his body rent with wounds. He would come no more, neither he nor so many of the swaggering, strong, fierce young men who had laughingly sailed away to trim Harold Fairhair's locks, and who had died at the hands of Goturm and his robbers. These were all dead too, except the one hapless beast who sat cowering in his hole in the cliff. Hungry and weary and frightened he must be. And when her father and Einar and Ivar and the rest dragged him out, what far worse agonies he would suffer. Rightly so, perhaps. Anlaf was dead and must be revenged, but Anlaf had died quickly. Anlaf had never delighted in hurting anything. Being a man he had to fight, of course, but he had never hurt anything that was defenceless. Perhaps this Goturm was a man just like Anlaf, who fought because he was a man. He must be a brave man, surely, and he had sent back Anlaf's sword. In Valhalla, he and Anlaf might even be comrades and fight side by side when Ragnarok came. But surely they would not be comrades if Goturm came all rent and mangled and said to Anlaf, "This is what your friends did to me when I was helpless, not in a fair fight." Why must men fight? Tonight a score of women were lying awake crying and mourning for their lost ones. In a few years, when the half-grown lads had become men, something similar would happen again to themselves, or they would inflict like suffering on some other little place. Life had no sense at all. Battle, slaughter, and revenge. On and on, through the ages, men fighting and dying, women toiling and weeping, and always hatred, hatred. Love is greater than hatred. Where had she heard that? Oh yes, Kull had said something about a great warrior, or one who could have been a great warrior, and who hadn't fought, but had said, "Love your enemies," and allowed himself to be killed. But that didn't make sense. Men had to fight. Why? Well, one had to kill one's enemies or be killed by them. But if no one hated, there would be no enemies, and men could live in peace. That certainly would mean happiness for women, and perhaps in time for men also. Some of them could make beautiful things of wood and metal and stone, and they seemed happy when doing so. Perhaps they could all be happy some day without any fighting, but someone would need to begin, just by not hating anymore, but by trying to love even one's enemies. The great man Kull had spoken about had perhaps tried to begin, but he died, and yet Kull said he was alive. That was impossible, but there was still sense in what he had said. Could she love her enemies? She could not. She hated the man who had killed Anlaf, the man who was now sitting trapped like a creature in a snare, who would by and by be dragged out and perish in agony. Yet he must be a brave man. He had swum until he must have been tired, and then he had climbed, or nearly climbed, the bare cliff of Tonga. No one had ever done such a thing before. While in every house in Burford someone found repose hard to come by, in his little cave at his airy height in Tonga's awesome steep, Goturm now lay fast asleep. The rocky recess in which he lay was some 5 feet wide and 7 or 8 deep, and in height barely sufficient to allow him to stand erect, short as he was. Not 20 hours before he had been one of the most powerful of the sea kings. Oikil and Onund, with the other 15 keels of his fleet, were only some hours ahead, in the place of rendezvous in Yalasound, about the middle of these accursed islands, not far away. He had had a fine ship, splendidly manned, so well manned that he had started late for the place of assembly, and had been lucky in falling in with a little Norwegian raider filled with plunder. Goturm's luck again. And here he was, the only survivor of that fine ship, his fingers and toes aching and torn after such a climb as no man had ever before, perched among the seabirds and as remote from aid as if hell's gates had already closed upon him. He was utterly tired and hungry, and he saw no means of escape. The splendid vision of a kingdom of his own in fertile England, which had filled his thoughts for years, had now shrunk. A shirt and the gold ring were his only possessions, but he still had faith in himself and in his luck. A tiny trickle of water, too little indeed to be called a trickle, through the porous rock at the back of the cave, had alleviated the worst pangs of thirst. What was it the old Vala had said at Alsund when he had asked her of his future? Goturm forgets yesterday, toils today, and seeks tomorrow. High will he climb, higher than any of his sires, but never high enough for Goturm. By Odin, that prophecy had already been fulfilled. He had already that day had such a climb as no man ever had, and yet he was not high enough. But he would climb no more unless he must. Tomorrow he would hold forth the golden ring. It might induce someone to succour him. If not, well, when night fell he would go forth and make the attempt again. Tonight it was hopeless to try with fingers and toes in their present state, so, overcome with utter weariness, he fell asleep. The following day the younger men were early afield to comb the western cliffs and wicks for further spoil from the wrecked ship. The Petister thralls accompanied them, and sufficient wreckage in the form of almost half the vessel was found at Woodwick to keep them intent and busy all day. The womenfolk went about their menial tasks, many of them with the added care of a wounded man in the house. About midday, Oddie Asgrimson died. He had been more seriously hurt than any of the others, and from the first his case had been hopeless, but when word spread that he had gone to Odin, his loss in the weakened state of the community was felt even more than it would otherwise have been. At night the elder men and some of the Sea Snake's crew assembled in Torbjorn's hall. Abundance of food and drink was set upon the long bare table, on either side of which was a long wide wooden bench, while at the top sat Torbjorn and Auslag in seats slightly higher than the rest. Two matters were discussed: the burial of Oddie, which was appointed for the following day, and the fate of Goturm. The boys had reported that he had held out a gold ring when he heard them shouting at the top of the cliff. They had pelted stones at the arm until it had been withdrawn. After various ghostly forms of punishment had been suggested, Einar said impatiently, "He is a man, enemy though he is. Let him die as a man." Torbjorn had listened in silence to all that had been said. Now he nodded. "The right of decision is mine. On the day after Oddie's burial, 2 men shall be let down to the cave. Goturm shall be bound and taken up, and carved into a blood eagle at the top of the cliff, and so left till he dies. Then he shall be given honourable burial, and a cairn placed upon him, not for his own sake, but for our own good name." Auslag had been silent throughout, directing by a nod or movement of her hands rather than words Gyda and the other thrall maids who attended to the wants of the guests. But the drinking tonight was tempered by the sorrow and the anxiety in every heart, and their business decided, the guests departed much earlier than had been their custom of yore. Nor had they alone decided on a course of action. Auslag too had made up her mind, at last. After a restless night, she had no peace of thought throughout the day. Several of the homes which had suffered loss she had visited, bereavement and pain everywhere, with bitter thoughts and plans of revenge as a poor solace. She had listened too to the discussion at her father's table. Hateful, dreadful things had been mooted and discussed. It was all so cruel and so senseless. It would not benefit anyone. It would lead to equally savage revenge some day by someone. True, the man was an enemy and had slain her brother. If he were freed, he would probably continue to slay until he himself was slain. That, however, did not concern her. All she knew was that if she ever meant to have peace of mind again, she must act as she had resolved, and act quickly. When her father retired to rest, Auslag was as yet busied about the hall. The thrall maids who slept in the loft above the barn departed. Gyda, the head maid, who alone slept in the house, remained, and to her Auslag turned and began speaking earnestly in a low voice. Amazement and even fear showed at first in the plain, stolid countenance of the maid as she listened. It had not been intelligence, but rather strength and activity that had won her favour in the eye of her mistress. After a time, she nodded and added a few words. If Goturm had slept soundly the first night of his captivity, he was in the other case now. During the day he had conserved his strength ever since his brief and useless attempt to procure succour by displaying the ring. A little rag torn from his shirt and stuck in a cleft at the back of the cave gradually moistened from time to time, and this he sucked and chewed. For 2 days now he had been without food and felt weaker. Knowing he must make attempt tonight, he slept, or tried to sleep, but when the time came he shrank. His fingers and toes at the very thought grew painful again. He resolved, although he himself recognised it as a weakness, to wait until just before dawn. Then, if he must die, it would be in the light of day. He drowsed uneasily as darkness came. Between waking and sleeping he heard a sound. A stone rattled near the mouth of the cave, then another and another. Soon a further sound reached his keenly listening ears, a scuffling, softer sound. Something dark swayed and dangled before the entrance of the cave, sufficiently clear against the western sky for him to see, too, the rope by which it hung. He moved towards the entrance. It was a bag of some sort, swaying gently at the end of a substantial rope. Laying on his breast, he reached as far forward as he dared. It was inches beyond his straining fingertips, and this way and that way as he tried in vain. He drew back and rose to a sitting position with his arms behind him, his hands gripping hard on the ground, thrust forth his feet, and between them gripped and drew the bag towards himself. Holding the precious rope tightly in his left hand, he undid the bag from its end, and then tied the rope around his body. Only then did he open the bag, which on examination was a coarse smock, such as haymen use. Within were oaten cakes, a small portion of smoked mutton, a little skin bottle of wine, and a seagull's feather. As he ate and drank, strength flowed back to his limbs, but swifter far, like a fire. Hope ran leaping through every fibre of his being. The rope was far stouter than had been needed for the food. It was strong enough to support a man. It was meant to support him. The smock indicated disguise, the feather speed and flight. He stood up after his meal, drained the wineskin and threw it away over the cliff. He donned the smock and secured the rope firmly under his armpits. Scarcely had he done so when the rope was tugged gently 3 times. He understood this as a signal for haste, and grasping the rope with one hand, stepped quickly off the ledge of his cave and immediately began to feel his way upward. It was a difficult task. The light was bad, and almost at once he was using both hands and trusting fully to the unseen hands above which maintained a steady, comforting pull. 10 feet above the cave was the overhang, and here he had great difficulty, so much that when the bulge had been overpassed, he had to pause and regain his breath. But continually, for his comfort and relief, there was the steady strain upon the rope, and thereafter the going was easier. Toe holds and finger holds became more frequent, and with one last continuous effort, he was at the top and lay exhausted, retching in the sweet grass stirred by the night wind, while billows of great darkness rolled over him, through which far off came the sound of voices. When he recovered, he found 2 women standing over him, the one young, fair and handsome, the other large, shapeless, swarthy, of uncertain age. In the dim light of the April night it was difficult to perceive them clearly. They stood apparently unconcerned, the one holding on her shoulder a stout coil of rope, the other an iron stake in her hand. So this is Goturm. The voice was certainly unconcerned and even contemptuous. He rose to his feet, swaying a little with giddiness. Goturm thanks you, whoever you are, and by all the gods of Asgard, Goturm shall reward you. Reward? She said, or rather hissed the young woman. Be silent and give careful heed. She pointed with the iron stake. You must hasten south at once along the cliffs, past the 2 little lochs you will see on your left until you come to Woodwick, the place where the hill descends steeply to the beach. Take any little boat that you can handle and row south. Keep to the west of Yala, the first large island to the south. You are safer so, and you must press on beyond Yala soon to the great island with the high hills. There you may be safe. Here, if you are found tomorrow or any day, you will die by the blood eagle. Why, maiden, surely here you do not war with shipwrecked men? All men must war against wild beasts. True, but I am not a wild beast, and torture is but revenge of the weak. I have harmed you not. Goturm, 3 days ago you met a Norwegian ship. On its deck stood a young lad who killed 3 of your men before you slew him. His name was Anlaf. Anlaf? Yes, I believe it was. But how do you know this? And you sent Anlaf's sword with your compliments to his father Torbjorn. I did. Know, Goturm, that but a moment ago when you lay retching, helpless as a newborn calf, Anlaf's sister Auslag stood over you with this iron stake, and pondered whether to crush your skull as a beetle is trodden underfoot. Know that you are on Torbjorn's soil, and that the day following the coming day has been fixed by him and his men for your doom. You are the boy's sister and Torbjorn's daughter. Then why have you done this? Are your men in hiding to take me? He sprang aside, picked up a large stone and gazed quickly around like a hunted creature at bay. You need not be afraid. Why I have acted so I know not. But better perhaps for the world if I had smashed the evil life out of you. You will do as you must do, but so must I. For me, there would never have been ease of mind in after time had I left you to be taken and tormented, so for my own sake I have saved you. And forgone your revenge? I have foregone revenge and hatred too, which hurts the hater. For me, you are a poor, contemptible, hunted wretch. I hate you not. Go as I have directed you, and take this food and drink for your journey. She raised from the ground a little bag, placed it before him, and turned away. Goudie turned with her, and they had gone a few yards when Goturm ran beside them. Maiden, he said appealingly, keeping pace, for they stopped not. I would not ask even to touch your hand. I cannot fittingly reward you now. I cannot even understand you. He held out towards her the bracelet of gold which he had taken from his left arm. This ring I took from the burial mound of Goudlad the Old, a great king in days gone by. Who wears it, so they say, will become a great king too. I give it to you for yourself, or for your sons. Aslak made no reply, but waved the offering away in silence. Then hear me yet a moment, and in his haste he ran forward, and turning stopped in their path. He held aloft the ring in his right hand. Aslak, each man swears by what he holds most sacred and most dear, and this ring is that to me. By this ring, I, Goturm, swear by Odin and Thor and by all the gods of Asgard, that should I ever have the power, I shall reward you, Aslak, Torbjorn's daughter, for my life-saving, and in a manner worthy of my state and worthy of you. For a brief moment they looked at each other. Then he replaced the ring on his left arm, and with an inclination of his head stepped aside. They passed on. Neither Aslak nor Goudie looked back, but Goturm watched until their forms were lost to sight in the Mildal. Retracing his steps, he picked up the bag left by Aslak and went hastily southwards along the cliffs, past the grey shoulder of the hill, through the sheepmoor, past the Northwater and Hamerwater, and so down the steep slope into the Dal of Widwick as the eastern sky began to redden. Chapter 3. 16 years have passed over Bernafart and the world, troubled, anxious time for all dwellers on the coasts of Western Europe. Harold Fairhair has not had any of his locks shorn, by his enemies at any rate. It is now 12 years since his fleet landed an army not 2 miles away at Haroldswick, in the beginning of his conquest of these islands. After the first, and to him feeble, resistance had been overcome, he had methodically cleared the islands of his enemies, those petty raiders who tried to nibble at his might. Now his henchman Sigurd was Jarl over all the Norderies, while here and there throughout the islands, settlers, kingsmen and jarlsmen had come from Norway. Torbjorn was dead, and dead too were many of his followers in resisting Harold. Among them was Einar, who had become Aslag's husband, and she was left with their little Helga and Thorsten, her children. Her dwelling now was a little cottage on the south side of the Mildal, looking down on the north end of the Loch of Cliff, and her domain a few acres of bitter, barren ground. Stackahul and its wide lands with thralls and sheep and cattle had been, for the most part, gifted by Harold himself to one of his captains, and all the better portions of the land round Haroldswick and Norwich were now occupied by him and his followers. Only round the end of the long firth were to be found some few cottages with their scraps of land, still belonging to those who had come with Torbjorn. Goturm's disappearance had caused great wonder and fear among them. Cool reminded Torbjorn of his vow that he would become a Christian after he had Goturm in his power for a day. Torbjorn denied that the condition had been fulfilled. His death soon after caused men to think that perhaps he had died through the anger of Cool's god, and all were inclined to look indulgently on Cool, and even at times to heed to his teaching. But only Aslak and one or two others of all the Viking folk openly accepted his faith. Hard and bitter as her toil was, she remained quiet and serene of manner, and even in a measure content. When men had been let down to take Goturm from the cave, they had found no trace of him. Had he fallen into the sea? News that a little boat was missing from Widwick made them guess nearer the truth. Further news some weeks later of a great Danish fleet in Yalesund increased the fear that someday he would return. How he had escaped no man knew, and no woman told. But time had passed, and with the war against their own kinsfolk the earlier fear was almost forgotten. Only rarely now did mothers quell their children by warning them that Goturm would catch them if they misbehaved. And what of Goturm? From the year 875 you will get many glimpses of him in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. First of all in company with his friends Oikel and Onund, and the three kings, Gothrum, Oskytel and Anwind, went down with a large army from Repton to Cambridge and sat down there 1 year. Soon he is in command of all the Danish forces in England, restless, courageous, unsatisfied, fighting with skill and cunning against the great-souled Alfred, sometimes victorious, often thwarted, so that at last he and his men swore on the Holy Ring, which they never before would do to any nation, and they would speedily depart from Alfred's kingdom. Finally, in the very year in which the invasion of Harold Fairhair completely ruined the fortunes of Aslaug and her father, in the same month at Wedmore, far in the south of England, Goturm the Dane and Alfred, King of England, sat side by side in lofty state. The feast was spread, harps twanged, and men drank deep. Great reason was for joy. The long war was over, and these two men had divided England between them. Goturm, at Alfred's request, had become a Christian. The king had been godfather at his baptism, so that now, according to Alfred, Goturm was Athelstan, the Rock of Honour. Goturm was the name he himself preferred, or even Guthrum, as the Saxons called him. What was it the old witch had said? Goturm will climb high, but never high enough for Goturm. Well, perhaps he would stop climbing for a bit and rest, once he had climbed. The great awful cliff rose before his mind's eye, the clamouring birds, the moistened rag, the girl in the dim light of the northern night, with the iron stake in her hand. His glance passed to the golden ring on his wrist. "Drink, man," said Alfred, "the mead is good. I know not if I ever tasted better." The Dane complied, but without comment. "Did you ever taste a better draught?" "Yes, King," Goturm replied, looking at his hands and opening and closing them. "Once I drank a draught finer than ever I shall drink again, even in Valhalla, or in paradise, as I now should say." Ever eager for a story, Alfred was not satisfied until he heard the tale in all its details. The sea fight, the wreck, the cliff, the rescue and the vow. "And have you yet rewarded this maiden of the Isles?" "No," said Goturm, "but some day I shall, as she deserves and as I can." Said the king, and changed the subject. She must have been a great-hearted woman, this Aslaug, but he could wish she had been less so, and that she had left this warrior in his cave. He trusted the Danes, of course. Trust was a fine thing, but a trained army and a strong navy were also fine things. And Goturm thought as he looked again on the ring, "Yes, some day I shall keep my vow to Aslaug. For the rest, forget yesterday, toil today, and seek tomorrow." For the next 10 years he was busily engaged in establishing his new kingdom in East Anglia, Mercia, and the north. Only once had he tried to grab a portion of Alfred's dominion, only to lose a portion of his own. Now older and more prudent, he had consolidated his power, and he was almost content. In England, that is. In Denmark he had hopes of further gains, and turned his thoughts northwards. 16 years then had passed after his escape from Tonga, when the great yellow sail with its red serpent was seen once more in Burrowfurt. One May morning, to the vast dismay of the northern island, a fleet of 6 war vessels, led by a huge warship of 40 pairs of oars, swept with a strong tide past the headland of Utter and swiftly turned into the narrow entrance of the firth. Ivor, he who had brought back Anlaf's sword so many years ago, was down at the end of the sands with young Thorsten, Aslaug's son. They had just returned from fishing in the firth, and had pulled their cobble a little way when the boy looked seaward. "See the ships, Ivor," he pointed, and Ivor gazed at the dreadful sail in the van. Just such another as he had once seen long ago. "Goturm!" he cried. "Run for the hill, Thorsten! Tell everyone! Run!" Bewildered eyes from the cottages were gazing on the sight. Soon Goturm was the one word anyone could say. With one accord all hurried, men, women and children, towards the heights. It was too late to make any stand on the beach at the landing place, but a rally might be made on the hill, though such an action could only be as hopeless as the fight against Harold had been. Ivor had hurried away to don his battle gear and remove his household. Thorsten ran all the way to his mother's house. "Mother, Goturm has come. Hurry, mother," he shouted, panting and pointing to the shore. "Who says so, boy?" "Ivor." He knew the sail and its markings. While every other person in the community who could hurry away from the beach did so, and while men were landing from the ships in small skiffs, 2 persons only came towards it from the landward, Aslaug and her son. The latter, brave lad though he was, following some distance behind. Before they reached the shore, a body of about 24 splendidly equipped warriors stood in a line 100 yards or so in front of the skiffs. Their two leaders stepped forward. One of them addressed her. "We come in peace, lady, to learn if Aslaug, Torbjorn's daughter, yet lives, and if so, to find her." "You have found her. I am she." "By Thor, I do not doubt you," he answered with a great laugh. "I was told that if you yet lived, you would act differently from all the rest." He turned to his men and gave a loud command, and they raised their axes high in a roaring shout that held no menace. "Aslaug, Torbjorn's daughter," he went on, "King Goturm of Engleland gave me 3 commands. The first to find you, and that I have done. The second, to put at your disposal for a month this fleet, if you will, with all its power to use against your enemies." He paused. She glanced at Stackahul, where stood the hall that Torbjorn, her father, and his men had built. From where she stood she could see the bench on which he was wont to sit. She looked out over heath-clad Hermaness, and turned her eyes to the steep slopes of Saxiford, and her inner eye saw all the fair lands around Green Scaw and fertile Norwick Bay, and the wide sweep of Haraldswick's cultivated fields. All this land had been the possession of her father and his men, and might again be the possession of her son. But the thought passed quicker than a lightning flash. "I have no enemies." Again he laughed. "Truly you are different from other women, and other men. But what would we poor fighters do without enemies? But so the king said it would be, and he is wise as our Goturm. There remains yet one command to perform." He shouted an order to the men who had remained by the skiffs, and at his words they rowed quickly back to the ships. "Now, boy," he said, turning to Thorsten, who had stood outwardly bold, but inwardly not free from fear, beside his mother, "run away to those fellows who are playing at soldiers on the hillside." He pointed to where Eric Olafsson, master of Stackhill, was drawing up his men with the slope behind them. "Tell their leader that it is peace, that Svein Ormsson, King Goturm's man, would have speech with him and all his men. Go with the boy, Rollo, as proof of good faith." Rollo grinned and slightly raised his arm in acknowledgement of the order. "Are they all to come?" "Yes, as many as will." At his word, they departed on their errand. The soldiers were permitted to relax and sit down in their ranks, jesting and idly watching. Some the skiffs returning laden to the beach, others the progress of Rollo and Thorsten. From the hillside they saw, after a brief pause, the body of men slowly descend, keeping good formation the while, and on the beach meanwhile 2 growing heaps of bales, chests and casks of armour, and apparel of every kind, as the skiffs plied between the ships and the shore. Sven turned to Aslaug when the advancing men halted a short distance away. "Are you sure they're your friends?" "They are my friends." He stepped forward between the parties. "Hear me, islanders. King Goturm of Engleland sent me here to find Aslaug, Torbjorn's daughter, and I have found her, and he sent me to aid her if need be against her enemies." There was a sudden movement and tenseness among the men facing him. "She tells me she has no enemies." The men relaxed. "And he has sent these gifts to her in token of his lasting friendship, and in repayment of a debt he owes." He pointed to the larger heap. "These other gifts," and he pointed to the smaller, "are for her friends. I would speak with your leader." Eric came forward, and the 2 men, exchanging names and greetings, eyed each other quietly. Sven saw a large, dour, fair-haired man, with blue eyes as cold and still as the winter sea round Bornholm. A resolute fighter probably, but likely to be slow of wit and foot. Eric saw a gorgeously accoutred man, with quick, darting dark eyes and a black, trim beard. More a soldier than a sailor, useful in command, but man-to-man and hand-to-hand, well, Eric would not fear him. Sven said, "Open speech is best, Eric. My king, by his gifts, has made this woman rich beyond all women, possibly, in the north. He bade me to make sure, also, that she would be safe in her riches. How can I carry out his wishes? Strong is his arm and wide his reach, but even a king's arm may be slow to ward off scathe, though quick to avenge it." "I have not heard," replied Eric placidly, "that either the Jarl of Orkney or Harold of Norway are lacking in length of arm or width of reach either. The woman has their protection." "I was not thinking of them, but rather the attitude of those nearer and around her." Eric for a little seemed not to comprehend, but when he did, his cold, bleak, seagull eyes were ablaze. He half raised his axe in his hand, and among the 2 bands facing each other many a man made certain of what he knew already, that his weapon was handy. "We are not thieves, if that's what you mean. In fair fight, weapon in hand, man against man, we take. We do not steal, we Northmen. Auslag, Torbern's daughter, may sit amid her wealth for 100 years with doors unbarred by night and day. She knows her countrymen if you do not. Sven's quick dark eyes searched the angry, suffused face. He justly prided himself on his ability to read the hearts of men. Then he laughed. Glad am I to hear this, Eric. He held out his hand, which the other, after a short hesitation, accepted. Come to the beach. The two went slowly towards the lesser heap of goods and gear upon the sand. At a gesture, Sven's men paced behind him, and the islanders also, drawn by curiosity, came slowly forward. They were followed diffidently by the women and children too, who for some time had been hovering anxiously at a distance. Sven raised his hand until he drew the attention of all, then cried in a voice loud enough for all to hear. These gifts King Goturm sends to Auslug's friends. As you are all her friends, and you, Eric, chief man over them, I deliver them to you to distribute, and to see that no one goes portionless. To himself he thought, no need to take hostages. These island beardies are honest enough with each other. He moved to the larger heap, and Eric, like a man dazed, moved with him. But Sven looked round for Auslag, and beckoned her to stand beside him. She came, and with her stood Torsten, his eyes round in wonder. As she looked down on chests filled with gold coin, on raiment sparkling with jewels, on bales of fine cloth and silks, rich armour, helberts, hauberks, drinking cups of gold and silver beautifully wrought, casks containing she knew not what, it all faded for a little. She saw it not, and once more with iron stake in hand she stood in the dim light on Tonga's cliffs, looking down upon a sick, half-naked man with unkempt hair and a pale, sweat-bedewed face. It passed, and she was in their midst, and Torsten's hand was in hers. All this is yours, lady, said Sven, and with it take the lasting friendship and remembrance of Goturm, who has paid his debt. Your friends will help you carry it home. He turned round, raised his hand in salutation to the silent throng, half turned with a special salute to Auslag, and waved his men into the waiting skiffs, and without more words stepped into his own boat and was rowed away. In a moment of time, it seemed, the fleet had hoisted sail, and the great dragon ships with oar and sail sped out the firth. Numerous and willing hands assisted in the task of bearing Auslag's treasures in triumph to her home. As the procession wound slowly along the burn, past the end of the loch and up the steep, bare slope, even she could not refrain from the reflection that, while she had no enemies, the number of her friends seemed of a sudden to have multiplied. And so that is the story of Goturm the Dane, as told by A.T. Clunas in his book Told Round the Peat Fire. We'll set the story in kind of a bit more of a wider context now. The first element I wanted to touch on was that there's obviously a very strong Christian, I suppose, moral to the story, which is a common theme in lots of stories and folk tales from Shetland. But they also occur in the sagas as well. It's really a subject for another day, far too big and long to discuss in any sort of depth here, but it's a very, very common thing, particularly with the Icelandic sagas and those written by Snorri Sturluson in particular, who was a Christian, and they were written by Christian authors and often contain strong Christian themes. One of the morals of this particular story, the story of Goturm, is be a good Christian, do the right thing, and you'll be rewarded for that. I think that's an element that definitely plays a big part in the story, even if it's kind of brushed over towards the end. But certainly, in terms of the rescue of Goturm and things like that, it's definitely an important consideration to keep in mind. But now we'll try and set the story into its places as well. All the places and locations mentioned in the story are real. The Battle of Hafrsfjord in Norway is a real battle that took place. It was where Harald Finehair became, in theory at least, the King of Norway, or King of all Norway. It's acknowledged as that moment in history where he gained ultimate power. And from that, lots of people did leave Norway. Those people who fought on the opposing side to Harald, they left, and a lot of them, at least according to the sagas and the stories, settled in Shetland and Orkney, and also in Iceland and Faroe as well. So the fact that kind of Torbjorn and his family are alleged to have arrived in Shetland as a result of that is certainly very possible. Obviously, it's impossible to prove with any certainty, but it is certainly a possibility. Burrowfirth, as I mentioned, is a real place. It is a long, kind of narrow fjord between Saxford and Hermaness at the north end of Unst. It's kind of as close to a fjord as it's possible to get in Shetland, really, with steep, high cliffs and this narrow, long inlet of water. The name Burrowfirth means Fjord of the Broch. The Broch is there as well. It's mentioned towards the start of the story where the Picts took their refuge. Again, impossible to prove that as fact, but the Broch is certainly there at a place called Burga Stack, which means stack of the fort of the Broch, which again makes sense. Stackahool is a real place. There's still a croft ruin on the site. It's possible that there was a longhouse there as well, although there's no way to prove that at the moment because the modern ruin is still on the site, essentially. But in areas such as Burrowfirth and lots of Shetland, good farming land is at a premium. So good sites would be reused from sort of Viking occupation right through into modern times, and it's very, very difficult to tell exactly where the original Viking Age houses were, quite often because, as I said, the modern ruins sit on top of them, which makes it very, very difficult to tell. Another possible longhouse site has been identified at the Mill Burn. It's in a very, very similar location to the house that's described as Auslug's in the story. It's pretty much in exactly the same place, as far as I can tell from the story, from the maps, from looking on the ground as well. There is what seems to be a longhouse site with signs of cultivation and working of fields around it, which is as mentioned in the story, possibly Auslug's house, which is really quite interesting. And there are, say, possible other traces of other Viking Age longhouses and such around the shores of Burrowfirth as well. The cave is there still. Again, as it mentions in the story, it's still marked on Ordnance Survey maps as Goturm's Hole. It's very, very inaccessible, kind of halfway up this steep, sheer cliff. But it is visible, it is there. And as I say, this story has stuck and remains something that's still spoken about, it's still known. And obviously the importance of it has kind of maintained the place name. We'll talk a little bit about Goturm himself now that we've spoken about the cave that he hid in. As it's mentioned again in the story, he went on to become a great king originally of the Danelaw, which was an area kind of mostly northern and eastern England. It included the ancient kingdoms of East Anglia and Northumbria, and also the northern half of Mercia, which was kind of sort of the Midlands and towards the west. Obviously, this only happened after he converted to Christianity, because in this story and in many others, good things only happen to Christians and not to pagans, which is an important thing to remember. But he did command Goturm did command the Danish armies against the Saxons. He was one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army that's spoken about an awful lot. It's quite well known as this Viking force that tried to conquer, and almost did conquer, all of England, forced Alfred into exile and things like that. So he was certainly a great warrior. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he's referred to mostly as Guthrum. That's the Saxon spelling. Again, it's mentioned in the story as well that's how he was referred to. And after his conversion to Christianity, his Christian name was Athelstan, which means noble stone or the rock of faith. That kind of thing is basically sort of, the rock upon which the Christian faith is based, or something along those lines. So that's kind of a bit more context for the story, and kind of giving it a wider berth. It's certainly possible that this could be a story that happened. after Shetland was colonised by Vikings and they took over the land from the Picts, it was, or seems to have been, used as a staging post for raids both back into Norway and also further south into the British Isles, as it is kind of implied that Goturm and his fleet are doing. There's lots of references to that in the sagas and also in Shetland folktales as well. It also say there were raids back to Norway against Harald Finehair. The phrase it uses in the story is to trim his locks, which I think is quite a nice little ode. It's kind of the local story is that Haraldswick in Unst is named after Harald Finehair from when he came across to quell the rebellions against him and to take his revenge upon the raiders who were raiding back into Norway from Shetland. Again, as is mentioned in the story of Goturm there. But yeah, let's have a look at sort of some of the reflections and the inspiration from this story, which continue into modern times. So Goturm, or Guthrum, as he's known, appears in 3 novels in Bernard Cornwell's Saxon series, namely The Last Kingdom, The Pale Horseman, and The Lords of the North. From these, he's portrayed in the TV series The Last Kingdom, which is based on that series of books. And the character Guthrum is played by Thomas W. Gabrielson, a Swedish actor. He also appears as Guthrum in the Assassin's Creed Valhalla video game. He's a non-player character, but he's an ally, or a potential ally, to Eivor, the player character in that game. To bring it a bit closer to home, in 1994, the Geyser Jarl in Lerwick, Charlie Grant, chose to portray Goturm the Dane, and he took a lot of inspiration from different elements of the story, particularly the serpent from the sail, sort of most notably, as a theme throughout the Jarl Squad's outfit and equipment. The serpent appeared on the shield. It was also embroidered into the Jarl Squad's cloaks. It was on their banners, various other things, brooches, and the nameplate for the galley, and so on and so forth. But lots of little details from the story were included as part of their sort of portrayal of Goturm. It also inspired the song Lower the Rope by a local band, the Revellers, whose music you already heard in the intro to this podcast. And the video for the song was filmed, at least in part, on location at Burrowfirth and Hermaness as well. I was actually listening to this song a couple of weeks ago, which was kind of inspired me to talk about this subject and to record it as a podcast for you all to listen to. So really, yeah, that's kind of what inspired this whole episode and the studying and the telling of this story, and yeah, kind of gave me the inspiration to bring the story hopefully to a new audience as well. So that'll really do it for this first episode. Again, without you, the patrons, the supporters of Adventure Shetland on Patreon, this episode, this podcast wouldn't be happening. So again, I need to thank you for your support. Hopefully you've enjoyed the episode and the story. It's the first of many to come, and if you have any feedback about the episode or the podcast in any way, it's more than welcome. Please leave a comment either on the Patreon, get in touch through the Patreon messaging service, or you can email me, john@adventureshetland.com, or through any of the, as I said, the social media channels. And yeah, that'll really bring this episode to an end. We'll close it out with the Reveller song Lower the Rope, which, as I said, has been inspired by the story of Goturm the Dane. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon.
This is a land of stories, of brave men and their tales of pain, so hear our glory and defeat at the hand of Goturm the Dane. We stopped the lowly merchant, gained so many treasures to behold, but we didn't reckon for the blood and quest for justice to unfold. The ship sailed towards us, stole everything, our blood was spilled in vain, but the leader saved some. He said, tell your people you've been spared by Goturm the Dane. Fate would serve us better. Guthrum's ship was wrecked, he lay waiting in a cave, planned a violent reprisal. Blood eagle to the back for vengeance that we crave. No more bloodshed, Lord of the road, tales of sorrow, now turn to hope. When we came to capture, we would find that the Dane had slipped away. He met with luck and kindness, we were denied a bloody judgment day. Years later we saw them, a fleet of Danish ships sailing to our lands, but peace and fortune was given to honor her who saved Goturm with her hand. No more bloodshed, Lord of the road, tales of sorrow, now turn to hope. No more bloodshed, Lord of the road,
there we are. I hope you've enjoyed that deep dive into a classic and traditional Shetland folktale and all of the extra information and context that's come along with that too. If you'd like more of this sort of thing, head on over to our Patreon at the link down below. If you sign up at the Explorer level or higher, your name will be added to the list of our current producers. If you find that you'd like to go to Burrowfirth or any of the other locations in Unst, or anywhere else in Shetland for that matter, head to our website adventureshetland.com where you can book a guided tour with me. Again, the link to that is down in the description below, along with our social media links and our online shop as well. Thank you very much for watching. I'm John from Adventure Shetland, and I will talk to you again very soon. Cheers for now.